going to introduce you.
Yeah, today we have Paula Lancaster, who is going to speak to us about last year she spoke about her PLO in phase 1, and she'll be reviewing that for those of you who weren't there, but also extending it out to phase 2 and 3 of the PLO, which I think you're all going to be very interested in. And she did this work alongside Joe Fisher. So take it away, Paula.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share the progress on our PLO with all of you. It is a simulated interaction, as you saw in that first slide. And I'm so thrilled to be able to represent my colleague Joe Fisher also in our work together. So again, I appreciate the opportunity. And just to follow along a little bit with what Day said, I have found every time I've had the opportunity to talk with colleagues or peers, and especially in this tag, about the work we're doing, the questions that you all raise just help me think so much more and so much more clearly about the work. I find that helpful too. So I would invite you throughout, if you need clarification or if you're wondering about something, to ask the question. Feel free to interrupt. You can put something in the chat if you want to. I'll try to keep an eye on that, but you can also just unmute and ask the question. There aren't that many of us, and so I mean there are 35, which is great, but I won't feel at all concerned about if you pop in with a question or so. So please feel free. So I'll start by providing a little context. I know some of you heard me talk about this simulated interaction earlier, as Beth alluded to, but as a refresher, the first 3 phases of this simulated interaction, and there are 4 of them altogether. There are 4 phases, but the first 3 phases of the interaction occur within a specific course, an undergraduate course that is generally taken after the midpoint of our preparation program. And it's taken directly before the first intensive field experience that our candidates have, which we call teacher assisting. So that's a field experience in which they're in buildings for about half a day throughout the week, and they do various things, but this course comes before that field experience. The course, we can go back just a little bit. I want to say just a few more other things about the course. It's for elementary general education students, and it's designed to prepare them for teaching in future inclusive classrooms. So that is the focus. It's on inclusive practices and a bit about just special education generally. But candidates have been introduced briefly to explicit instruction, but their knowledge is very, very fragile at this point. So that's kind of where they are. Okay, now we're ready to go on. So that's the context of the course itself. And then on this slide addresses the context within what kind of situates this simulated interaction, the PLO, within the McDonald and colleague model, addressing the 2nd and 4th stages. In some ways, yes, also it's the 3rd as well. So we're preparing and rehearsing, we're doing some enactment, and then we're also eventually getting to the analysis of enactment and moving forward. So it's developmental in nature, the PLO, and I think as we get into more of the description, you'll see what is meant by that. So we can move on to the next one. And as I mentioned, the PLO consists of 4 phases, and I will provide a little bit more detail later of each of the phases, but for now, just understand that our candidates work through these 4 phases in the order that you see. And in each phase then adds a little bit more complexity and a little bit more difficulty for our candidates. The first 3 phases, as I said, take place within a course. The 4th one takes place in that field experience that I mentioned follows the course. And in the first 3 phases, we actually start in a traditional classroom on campus. It's usually a face-to-face course. And then after a few weeks, we just pick up and move into a building, but we're still all in the same course. So that's kind of the description of the 4 phases. We begin with delivery of very content neutral lessons to peers. And as I said, I'll describe them a little bit more. but they're practicing explicit instruction, and each phase increases the complexity as they move along. So let's take a look at, well, the next one, I'll get into the content that we're teaching in the next slide. So before the start of the semester, and we teach this course both in the fall and in the spring semester, but before the start of the semester, weeks before, in fact, we meet with teachers whose students our candidates will eventually work with. So these are kind of our host teachers, and we meet with them ahead of time. And we offer some options of content that we would like our candidates to practice providing, to practice implementing. So we offer up some options, but then teachers ultimately choose based on a combination of factors. So they decide what it is that our candidates will be teaching to their students. And their factors, include a range of things. Sometimes it has to do with the time of day that we'll be there in the buildings, or it might be the semester, the time of year and what they're teaching at that time. It also, of course, hinges very much on what they believe their students really need some extra assistance in. But we are very, very careful to make sure that we're working with their students at a time that doesn't take away from really critical instruction that they would be getting with their teacher. So we coordinate very closely with our host teachers to make sure that we're aligning with what they need. And again, like I said, they make the choice. So in this case, the example that we're going to be talking about is cognitive strategy instruction. And that's one of the options that we choose. And generally, when we go the route of cognitive strategy instruction, that means that our candidates will be working with upper elementary aged students and not younger ones. So we provide a little bit of instruction ahead of time about cognitive strategies and what we mean by that. So we teach our candidates what they are generally, and we help them think about what tasks are worthy of cognitive strategies, that if you're going to provide pretty intensive cognitive strategy instruction, you need to be judicious about what those strategies might be and based on student need. Then we also address what instruction is necessary for fluent use of strategy. So if we expect children and youth to be able to use the strategies we're teaching, we are probably leaning into explicit instruction. And explicit instruction really is the practice that we want our candidates engaged in during this experience. So that's kind of a given, but the what that they're teaching is negotiated. And so in this case, the strategy that we've chosen is the WRAP strategy, which is a summarization strategy. It was developed by Jean Shoemaker, Peggy Denton, Don Deschler. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. I'm guessing probably quite a few, but the paraphrasing strategy uses the acronym WRAP. So eventually our candidates will be teaching their students how to read a paragraph, ask themselves what are the main idea and important details in that paragraph, and then put the main ideas and details into their own words. And that's what we'll be working on together. And we've also referenced the Hageman article, which is a very good one to, if you want a refresher on the paraphrasing strategy, go there for sure. So, once we have decided what the content is, we spend time in class making sure that our students have adequate background knowledge to be able to teach it. So what that means is that every semester, if teachers choose something different for us to work on, we have to make adjustments to our course so that we're front loading that critical information. So then we'll move into phase one, and here's where we'll provide a little bit more detail on phase one. So in this case, we have already decided we are going to be focusing on the high leverage practice of explicit instruction. And we already know that we are going to be delivering cognitive strategy instruction through explicit instruction. So the next thing then that we have done is we have kind of analyzed explicit instruction as well as our candidates, I should say more of our finishers, our completers, and how they're doing within explicit instruction, because that helps us to understand what are the elements of this practice that we really want to focus on. What do we know that our candidates typically struggle with when it comes to explicit instruction? And we actually have a group of teachers that we consult with who have worked with our program and with our candidates for years. They give us the unvarnished feedback about how they're doing and what their strengths and weaknesses are. And based on that conversation, as well as our own observations of candidates, we know that most of our teacher candidates, and I think novices in general, struggle with certain elements of explicit instruction. And for us, those elements are describing and explaining, providing really clear descriptions and explanations of what it is that they're teaching. The big one, modeling with the think aloud attached to it. They really struggle with that. And they struggle with engaging students throughout both of those elements. So the point here is, in selecting these focal elements, is that we're not necessarily addressing the entirety of explicit instruction. We have really tried to hone in on what we know our candidates will have difficulty with and really focus in those areas. You may have different focal elements that you discover in your own observations of candidates, and I think that's fine. It's just the idea that we're trying to get at the right, I don't know if grain size is the right word here, but we're trying to get at the right kind of level of specificity and precision that will help our candidates grow in their practice the most. So we start there. And then the other thing we do in phase one, so let me back up a little bit. So we start there, here are the focal elements, and we provide very, very explicit instruction on these elements. So we describe them in detail, we model them, we often bring in video of others doing these particular elements and stop and pause and take a look and talk about what we've just seen. We do the non-example example of what it is and what it is not. And then eventually we're going to ask our candidates in phase one to do a simulated interaction with each other. And in order to prepare them for that, we try to completely lighten the cognitive load around what it is that they'll teach, because we only want them focused as much as possible on these elements. So we ask them to do these simulated interactions with neutral content that they don't have to think about a whole lot, content that they should all be kind of on an even playing field with. So it's things like, in this example, packing a lunch. How do you pack a lunch? Everyone should have a sense for that. They shouldn't have to struggle with that content. But just in case, we actually have a document, the structured protocol and lesson planning templates, where we have identified what we think the steps for packing a lunch are. And we've given them a structured set of questions to guide them in their planning. So again, just lightening that cognitive load as much as possible. And we show them the observation protocol, the rubric that will be used when they're in their simulated interactions. Then on the other side of the simulated interaction is their peer group. And so their peers also have a structured protocol in their role playing of students. So we're not just doing a kind of traditional role play where it's sort of a free for all, where the candidate will role play the skills and their peers will just react. We have kind of scripted the reactions. So we know the kinds of questions that children ask when they're confused about something. So if the description is clear and kind of on point, then the peers are instructed to, be pretty agreeable and learn and understand. If the candidate is providing descriptions or explanations that aren't clear or that they're too fast, we've given their peers a script so that they can interrupt and say things like, oh, wait, I don't understand, or I didn't get that, or they have specific questions to ask. So we've kind of identified what we're hoping to see in these simulations, and we've identified how we think students might react when our candidates hit the mark and when they don't hit the mark. So it's scripted a little bit, but we feel like we get a more authentic practice out of that approach. So that is what phase one, that's what happens in phase one. They receive this instruction and then they do their simulated interaction with their peers. So I think we can, unless we have any questions, we can move on to phase two.
I have a question. You mentioned the rubric that, or a rubric or an observation tool. Do the students have to reach a certain level of proficiency in phase one before you move them on to phase two? And is the rubric what's used for that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dave. Thank you. We're not really thinking of it as an assignment that's graded, but when we teach about cognitive strategy instruction, for example, and we do teach them about the levels of practice, for example. So when you're teaching a strategy, you want to give your students a chance to practice. We use 80% as a mastery mark. And then we just keep that 80% as a mastery mark throughout the entire class. So they become very accustomed to 80% as being kind of a mastery mark. But thank you for that. I always forget about little, details like that we just have been doing for so long that they don't stand out to me as interesting anymore. Yeah. Okay. So then, so everybody gets a chance to do the simulated interaction with the packing of a lunch. And you could certainly choose other content neutral tasks to do besides packing a lunch, but that's what we have kind of arrived at. So then we'll talk a little bit more about phase two. So in phase two, we're going to do our second simulated interaction, and I'm kind of revisiting the content here, but for a legitimate reason. So as I mentioned earlier, we select content with our collaborating teachers, with the teachers that we're going to be working with. And I wanted to show you that sometimes other content gets selected. So typically it lands in one of these three areas. Typically we're using cognitive strategy instruction and teaching a strategy like RAP. We may also be doing some aspects of phonological awareness, in which case we'd probably be working with younger students. And on rare occasions, we address early numeracy and number talks, again, with younger students. So as I mentioned earlier, those content areas are agreed upon before the start of the semester. So then we have to adjust everything that happens later, because we keep the same content through all phases of this particular PLO. So in phase two, now we're going to still focus on those focal areas within explicit instruction, the describing, the explanation, the modeling, and the keeping the levels of engagement. But now our candidates are going to do a second simulated interaction with their peers, but this time it's with the RAP strategy, with the teaching of the strategy, the cognitive strategy instruction. So we make sure that they are fully fluent in the strategy. We provide that necessary background knowledge for the strategy. They actually learn it kind of like a student would learn it and have a chance to try it out. It's really hard to provide explicit instruction on something that you've never done before, as I'm sure we all know. So we give them that opportunity. And then in this case, we really kind of tighten up on our feedback. So we recognize that our candidates are going to they're going to be challenged in giving each other feedback, constructive feedback. So we do work a little bit more at this level on what good feedback should look like and how it should sound, and the expectation that everybody should be getting some good constructive feedback. So we spend a little bit of time talking about how you deliver that and how you accept it, and getting into the notion that all professionals receive feedback. But we still struggle a little bit with that, in that we still have candidates who, one, have a hard time accepting the feedback. But I think the bigger issue is that candidates do have a hard time providing constructive feedback to each other. They really want to fall on the things that they did great, and not so much go the other direction. So phase two is very repetitive from phase one, except that it is focused actually on the strategy instruction. So we've upped the complexity a little bit, introduced the content into the mix, and tightened up or introduced the feedback. My light goes off all the time, so let me just turn that back on so I can see my notes. Okay. And that's phase two, but we're still in the classroom in phase two. So keep that in mind too. We're still in our, on the university campus and in our classroom. And now we move on to phase three, where we've had a chance to practice. We're feeling pretty good about the content that we're going to be teaching. And now we're moving into the school. and working with the students, with children in the schools. And again, it's the same content, so we have some familiarity there. We still spend some time with planning. We still do a little bit of practice before the children arrive, especially in the first week or two. And I think that what's important here is that we do allow for a little bit more flexibility in the lesson planning from our candidates, but we're still providing a template for their lesson planning. And we actually collect those templates after every session and provide feedback back to them on their planning. They have to do you'll see on the last item there on the list is that they have to provide notes after every session. So they provide their notes for every session, and then they have some time to fill out their lesson plan template for the next time. And we make sure that whatever they're planning is aligned to what they put in the notes and give them some feedback. We're careful that we're not wasting student time. So sometimes we have to intervene a little bit more to make sure that the children are getting what they need from this. But usually by the time we get into the 6th or 7th week of the tutoring, our candidates are getting pretty good at meeting the needs of their students. So we provide the lesson plan template. These tutoring sessions are supervised. Usually they take place in the cafeteria in a building or the gym, or occasionally we're in a library. We have a hard time getting those spaces, but we're usually in a wide open space or maybe 2 adjacent rooms so that the instructor can move back and forth and stop in on each session every time and just either check in or provide some on the spot feedback, or maybe even do some model instruction as the tutoring sessions are going on. The children become very, very accustomed to this. And we also feel that it's important for our candidates to know that this is just how it works. You're still learning, so occasionally your instructor might stop by, watch for a while, might interrupt, might even step in and model or demonstrate something. So supervised sessions, we do a pre and a post brief with the whole group, and then they have the time to do their notes for next sessions and their lesson plan.
Hey, Paula, I have a quick question. Do you guys ever videotape those tutoring sessions and then maybe analyze them further?
That's a great question. We have not done that in these situations. We do sometimes videotape in phase 2. Sometimes we ask our candidates to record, and then they can talk about them, or they can monitor their own progress. Over time, they can reflect back on what their skills were like earlier and what they are now. But we haven't done videoing in this case. I think that is a really good idea. And I don't think we'd have any struggles with the students, because we really could, because they're in such small groups, we really could focus the video just on the teacher candidate. Yeah.
Sure.
Paula, do the teacher supervisors, do they give the candidates feedback? Because I know you have that explicit instruction rubric where it's either, did you see it or not, kind of thing. The 1-point rubric.
They do, yes. The instructors do give the feedback. And sometimes, in my own experience, there are occasions where, as I visit the sessions as they're going along, I'll see themes that need to be addressed. And so it just turns into a kind of a mini lesson. And sometimes we end up doing some rehearsals as a debrief. Because especially around modeling, again, I go back to modeling so much, but sometimes we actually have to just pause and do some rehearsals as part of the debrief, because we just aren't hitting that mark when we're with the kids.
Could I ask one more question?
Sure, please do.
So this is the 3rd time then in their program they've had a chance to really experience explicit instruction.
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that I believe makes this a fairly effective approach is that they learn a little bit about explicit instruction before they get into the course. But they do, just in this course, they do these 3 iterations of explicit instruction focus only on, or primarily on, those really critical features. And then if you think about it, Mary, actually in phase 3, they have at least 7 chances. I mean, we're usually in the schools for 10 weeks, but the first week we mostly are getting to know the students. So they get at least 7 or 8 chances to try out their instruction and to continue to improve their instruction just there. But even within this, within the course, yeah, they're getting these multiple iterations that each time gets a little bit more complex. And each time I think we're kind of pushing the envelope on them, trying to get a little bit more independent in their enactment of the practice. And I also find that, on their exams and, the assessments that they have, their ability to talk about instruction increases dramatically in the course of this semester. I really feel like they become a lot more focused on their teaching. I like to point out that suffix, that ing, like we spend a lot of time talking about characteristics of good teachers, but we're really trying to focus on the teaching. What is the work that you're doing, and how can you continue to make it better? And we develop this very, I think, clear understanding of what we're asking for as part of these consistent iterations.
Thanks. That was great. Thank you.
Yeah, any other questions too, feel free. And I do want to spend some time talking about how we establish the partnerships for this activity and what we consider as important, because we've had some misses. We've had some partnerships that didn't go as well as others. So we've arrived at I think some critical features for our partnerships. And the first one that's on this list is we really push on the notion of unequal mutual benefits. We used to have the goal of, we want this to be mutually benefit. We want our candidates and our program to get what we need from the experience, and they get a chance to try something out with students, but we also want the students and the teachers to benefit in some way. We've learned over time that it's actually better in our initial meetings with teachers to insist that most of the benefit is on their end. We just tell them we absolutely do not want to be a burden. The moment we're a burden is the moment we need to, call an end to this partnership. We want their students to benefit. We want them to benefit. We want whatever we're doing to fit perfectly within their classroom. And taking this kind of stance has changed the conversation. We've had in the past people that, once we've made the pitch, they've said, yeah, sure. And we didn't really pick up on their hesitancy. We should have, because when teachers are hesitant about taking on something like this partnership, it's often not as successful as it could be. But when they know that we really understand how complex adding something like this activity to their plate might be, and that we're going to be taking students out of their classrooms, we want to be well aligned. Once they, I think, feel that sense that we get that they are the most important, that they're doing the most important work in all of this arrangement, they're better able to say no if it doesn't work. But they also have a clearer idea for what they're kind of getting into. And we just feel like it's the whole process has been much smoother when we put out there, the moment this is not what you think it is, we're good. We can walk away and we'll go somewhere else and it'll be okay. We'll come back maybe in a couple semesters. So that's the first conversation that we have. We also do, make sure that we have a philosophical match. It doesn't help us to be in a building where they're not very keen on explicit instruction, for example. Now that's gotten much, much better over time. We rarely find philosophical match to be an issue anymore. But if you think back a while ago, particularly around literacy instruction, sometimes we would find ourselves in places where maybe we weren't such a good match for what we wanted to do and the direction that the district or the school wanted to go. We are also really clear about the criteria for what that instructional focus will be. We want to make sure that we're teaching things, we're having our candidates teach things that are critical for children to learn. We do not want to waste children's instructional time. We also don't want to just be doing activities. You know, if it's something that a candidate can do with their niece or nephew, then it's just at home for fun, then it's not worth us moving into a building to do. So this is, you know, really critical, important, complex content is what we want to be focused on. And we also want to address things that we know are challenging but critical for beginner teachers. What is worthy of them doing this level of practice on? And so I think that the 3 examples that we gave for where we usually arrive fit that criteria. And those 3 have really, you know, consistently kind of been the ones that have come up and have risen to the top. And I see there's a question. How do candidates generally respond to what's worthy of cognitive strategies? That's a great question. Sometimes they're just asking, or sometimes they're thinking about things that I would say are more nuisances of teaching, more things that teachers are troubled with but aren't really troubling to kids. So they want to extinguish certain behaviors maybe that we don't think are really worthy of cognitive strategies. So we try to steer them toward, you know, other more important tasks or, you know, things that kids have to take on. But it is interesting to ask them that question. So I would encourage you to do that and see what your beginner teachers come up with about what's worthy of developing a strategy for.
Paula, if I follow up on that,
Yeah.
what would be the criteria you'd use for a good response to a question like that?
I think it's, you know, we tend to think about things that students, because we're often thinking about children with disabilities, we often think about things that students struggle with. So, you know, we'd start by, you know, what are some skills or approaches that if students had these in their repertoire, they could be much more successful in the academics. So we want to make sure that whatever strategy, a cognitive strategy we're going to take up, it addresses a true instructional need for this child. So it addresses a need, and it addresses a need that occurs pretty regularly. So that would be another one. I would say it has to be something that actually requires some thought on behalf of the student. So we would make sure, and that's the cognitive side of it. It's not just sort of a follow the leader kind of thing, but it actually requires children to think and engage in a way. And I think it's probably the biggest one is that it's something that can be used outside of the 4 walls of your classroom. If it's only for inside of your classroom, then ask yourself, you know, why are we doing this? So strategy should be generalized, and that's a big criteria that we use. There are probably other better ones that you all could add to that list too. Yeah, transference for sure.
Yeah. Paula, this has been awesome. I think you have a couple more points. I want to let you get to those, but I did also want to ask a quick question about your host teachers. You mentioned that they offer some suggestions about what strategies or what type of teaching they wanted their candidates to do. I wondered if those host teachers are proficient in those strategies, so that as far as the supervisors are concerned, so that they are also good models of that type of teaching for the candidates. Yeah. Is that something that you all spend time thinking about or have noticed anything that needed to be addressed?
We're much better at this than we have been in the past. I mean, we're pretty deliberate in creating, so we have an observation tool, just a general observation tool for going in the classrooms, but now we pull out these specific features. They are bolded on the tool, and we talk ahead of time with our mentor teachers about the things that we're going to be looking for specifically. We do try to tap into alumni as much as possible, people who we know have been through our program and kind of know what we're all about. It doesn't always happen, but that is really helpful. But I think just sharing that crystal clear rubric and, being specific about these are the things that we absolutely need to see from our candidates has helped us decide whether a placement is the right place or not.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Sure. We do visit at the end of each semester with our teachers to make sure, things have gone well. And, the other thing that I haven't mentioned is just we're careful about overburdening our candidates. So we pay attention to how far we're making them travel, all of those types of things, because this is a little bit of, it's extra work for them. So we do try to keep that in mind and watch which semester, what else this course is paired with so that they're not, running off to a whole bunch of other places as well. So I know we want to get into some questions and some the discussion, which I am very intrigued about. So are there any kind of last minute questions before we go here? Or yeah, let's go here.
Yeah. Well, we'd love to hear. I think the discussion in the chat has been super rich and lots of good questions, but are there any other questions for Paula, or would anyone like to just share how they are envisioning potentially using any of these phases in their work, or how have you used it? Like, what are you all thinking about right now?
Hi, Paula. Not a question, but just a compliment. This was extremely well structured, and I can see already intuitively how it can apply in our program. I do have a question. Does this also translate to other domains of teaching, like maybe teachers who are practicing picking assessments, the right assessments or something like that? And thank you.
Yes, for sure. It could be a template for just about any practice that you want to address. I don't see why, I can't think of a reason why not at this point. I think, to me, the important thing is thinking about that practice but digging a little deeper into it so that it's not too broad of a focus. Yeah, I hope that happens. I mean, I'd like to do it with more practices just in our own setting.
Mary says she's thought about the AACTE clinical practice document as you were talking. So much translation there.
Yep, for sure.
Any other questions or comments? Thinking about how you could use this?
Paula, I do have one question. When you move to phase 4, it's outside this class and the candidates are teaching in small groups, and it's not, as carefully structured in terms of content and everything. How do you see explicit instruction then when they move into that setting, which is more complex, less structured? What happens? What do you notice from your candidates?
We do still see them struggling with modeling in particular. And I think it depends so much on their fluency with the content that they're teaching. So where we see them able to keep students engaged as they're working through explicit instruction, we also realize that that's probably because they have a good handle on the content as well as explicit instruction. When we see them struggle, we're fairly certain that the struggle is because they're not comfortable with their content knowledge. Because we watch them in this class, we know that they have a pretty good understanding, a really strong understanding of how to describe something, how to model it, how to keep kids engaged. But once they get into less familiar territory, they still struggle. And just like anything else, when you're trying to get good at something, if you don't stay focused and have that feedback, it's so easy to revert back to, substandard enactment. So I would say, Mary, that the modeling is still a struggle. And it's a struggle for them to see good exemplars of that in classrooms. And then it's just the cognitive load increases. Plus they really want to manage those small groups so well. They have a hard time with that part of it too.
Yeah, I think you're really pointing to the essential role and that practice plays and content knowledge. I mean, the two come together in a really critical way. And teachers, I just find we haven't we need to create a system where they have more opportunities to practice. I think you don't see the modeling that you want all the time because they just have not had the kind of careful practice they need over time to become really sophisticated.
Yeah. Yep. I would say that we do get feedback. Our feedback from our cooperating teachers, our mentor teachers, is pretty strong regarding explicit instruction in particular. But yeah, I agree, Mary. The practice, the repetition of that practice is so important. It's muscle memory in some ways. Yeah.
Paula, what kind of feedback do you get from the students about
love
their
it.
experience? Yeah.
They honestly, they love every part of this. The hardest thing for them is giving and taking feedback from each other. The rest of it they love. They love the simulated interactions. They love the scripts. They love the rubrics. They want that for everything that they do. So I have yet to have a student say, I really hated that experience. It's just always on the other side. I think they're just, they're smart enough to know what they don't do well. And this just really gives them something tangible to focus on and work on.
Hey, Paula, I have a quick question. Do you increase the simulated interaction scripts, the level of interaction the peer candidates are providing in level 2, basically?
It's not that different. No,
Okay.
no. It's pretty much the same. I do think if you were taking up a practice that's more related to behavior, you could play with that a little bit more, and that might be interesting. When you're thinking about behavior, the scaffolded part of this might be a little bit different than when you're thinking about content or instruction, I guess, instructional strategy, instructional practices.
Right.
Awesome. Were there any other questions? Paula, we thank you so much. This has been incredible.
Yes, very